Thomas Calloway was a man who had already buried his life. He just didn't know he was about to dig it back up. For 5 years, the wind was his only companion. It was a lonely sound, scraping across the endless plains of the high prairie, a constant reminder of the silence that had filled his small ranch house since Sarah died. Grief wasn't like a storm that comes and goes. For Thomas, it was like the dust. It settled on everything, got into every crack, and dulled the shine of the world. He was 35, but the sun and sorrow had carved the lines of an old man into his face. He moved through his days like a ghost, his only purpose the rhythm of survival. Tend the cattle, mend the fence, eat, sleep, repeat. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, and he avoided it. The people there looked at him with either pity or suspicion, and he couldn't stand either. He preferred the company of the land, which was just as harsh and unforgiving as he felt inside. He'd built walls around his heart so high and thick that he'd forgotten what it felt like to feel anything at all. He didn't live anymore. He just existed, and he thought that was how it would be until the day the prairie finally claimed him. He was wrong. So terribly wrong. It was late afternoon, the sky bleeding orange and purple, when he saw it. A smudge of movement down by the dry arroyo on his southern fence line. A storm was building in the west, the clouds bruised and angry. His first thought was a lost calf, but as he guided his horse closer, a knot of ice formed in his gut. That wasn't an animal. It was a person, small and huddled against the rising wind, almost swallowed by the dry brush. He swung down from his horse, his rifle feeling loose and familiar in his grip. Out here, a surprise was usually a bad one. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Something metallic. Blood. He crept closer, his boots making no sound on the dusty earth. And then he saw her. A young woman, her clothes torn to ribbons, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood. Her arm was bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. She was Apache. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and on the left side of her face, a network of intricate geometric scars ran from her temple to her jaw. They were old scars, healed over, but they gave her face a fierce, unforgettable look. His caution, the hard shell he'd built for 5 years, cracked just a little. This wasn't a threat. This was a person broken and left for dead on his land. He knelt, speaking softly. "Hey, you all right?" Her eyes flew open. They were dark and wide, filled with a terror so profound it struck him like a physical blow. She flinched, trying to scramble away, a pained gasp escaping her lips. In her good hand, she clutched a small, crude knife, holding it up with a strength he couldn't believe she still possessed. "Easy," he said, holding up his empty hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the tone. Her eyes darted from his face to the empty plains behind him, searching for a threat he couldn't see. He could tell her arm was broken, probably a few ribs too. Her lips were cracked and peeling. She wouldn't last another night out here, especially with the storm rolling in. Leaving her wasn't an option. It was a line he wouldn't cross. The part of him that was once a good man, the part that had loved Sarah, wouldn't allow it. "I need to help you," he said slowly, pointing to her arm, then to the distant shape of his ranch house. "Shelter, medicine." She watched him, the fear in her eyes warring with the sheer agony she was in. He knew in that moment he was making a choice that could unravel the quiet, miserable peace he had made for himself. He was letting the world in. He just didn't know the world was coming for him with teeth and claws. He moved carefully, lifting her into his arms. She was light as a bird, and she went rigid with pain, a small cry escaping her lips before she bit it back. The ride back was a slow torment, the first drops of rain stinging their faces. When he finally got her inside his small, dark cabin, he laid her gently on his cot. She immediately curled into a ball, shivering, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. He built a fire, the flames chasing the shadows into the corners. He needed to set her arm, and he knew it was going to hurt. He gathered splints, clean rags, and a basin of water. Kneeling beside her, he explained with gestures what he had to do. She watched him, her jaw tight with fear, but she gave a single small nod. He took her arm gently. "This is gonna hurt," he said, his voice rough. "I'll be as quick as I can." He pulled, setting the bone with a sickening snap. She screamed, a raw, sharp sound that tore through the cabin and was swallowed by the howling wind outside. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't fight him. She endured it with a silent, fierce strength that stunned him. He quickly splinted and bound the arm, making a sling to hold it against her chest. When he was done, she sagged back onto the cot, exhausted, her breathing ragged. But as he looked at her, he saw something shift in her gaze. The terror was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of disbelief, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of trust. He offered her water, which she drank greedily, and some dried meat, which she ate in small, hesitant bites, her eyes never leaving his face. He sat in his chair by the fire, the storm raging outside, and watched the strange, wounded woman who had fallen into his life. Where had she come from? Who had done this to her? The scars on her face, the terror in her eyes. This was no accident. She was running from something, or someone. He had brought her in, offered her shelter, a simple act of decency. But as he sat there, the rifle across his lap, a cold feeling crept over him. He hadn't just saved a life. He had invited trouble to his doorstep, and trouble on the high prairie always came calling. The storm passed, but the woman stayed. For days she was a silent, watchful presence in his cabin. He learned her name was Nahili. He told her his was Thomas. The words were strange in the quiet space between them. He tended to her wounds, brought her food, and moved with a slow, deliberate calm, trying not to spook her. He could feel her eyes on him constantly, weighing him, judging him. He did the same. He wondered about the scars, the story behind them. But he didn't ask. He just let the silence stretch, hoping it would eventually build a bridge. Slowly she began to move, first just sitting up, then limping around the small cabin. She started helping in small ways, folding his blanket, sweeping the floor. Her movements were filled with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the harshness of her life. The silence began to change. It wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. They ate their meals at the rough-hewn table, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates. But it was enough. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, she spoke. "Ran away," she whispered, her English broken. He looked up, surprised. She nodded toward her own face. "Bad sign," she said, her voice filled with a pain that had nothing to do with her broken bones. "They said, banished." The word hung in the air between them. Cast out. He looked at the intricate marks on her skin. To him, they didn't look like a bad sign. They looked like she had survived something terrible. A flicker of his own loneliness, his own feeling of being an outcast, connected with hers. He found himself speaking, the words tasting rusty in his mouth. "My wife, Sarah, she died." He gestured to the emptiness of the cabin. "Sickness. 5 years, just me." She didn't offer pity. She just listened, her dark eyes holding his, and in their depths, he saw a profound understanding. She knew what it was to be alone. In that moment by the fire, two outcasts from different worlds found a piece of common ground. As she healed, she grew stronger. She helped him with chores outside, her knowledge of the land far surpassing his. She showed him which plants could be used for medicine, making a poultice from a root that eased the ache in his knee better than any liniment. He, in turn, taught her his world, how to load the rifle, how to read the weather in the clouds. But as a fragile peace settled over the small ranch, Thomas couldn't shake a feeling of being watched. Sometimes when he was riding the far fences, he'd see a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, a rider who would disappear as soon as he was spotted. He found tracks near the creek that weren't his and weren't Nahili's. Someone was out there, biding their time. One afternoon, he found a small, carved wooden bird near the well. It was crudely made, but the style was not from any tribe he knew. He showed it to Nahili. The moment she saw it, all the color drained from her face. The terror he'd seen when he first found her returned, tenfold. She snatched the bird, her hand trembling, and threw it into the fire, where it was quickly consumed by the flames. "They know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They know I'm here." "Who knows?" Thomas asked, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. "Who's coming for you?" She looked at him, her eyes pleading. The men who gave me these. She traced the scars on her face. They are not scars, she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear. It is a map. Before Thomas could process what she'd said, the dog started barking, a frantic, furious sound. He looked out the window and his blood ran cold. 4 riders were approaching, and at their head was Brody, a local rancher with a mean streak as wide as the prairie and eyes as cold as a snake's. They weren't just passing by. They were riding with purpose. They were riding for his house. Go inside, he said to Nahili, his voice low and urgent. Lock the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. She looked from the riders to his face, her own a mask of fear, but she nodded and disappeared inside, the heavy bar thudding into place. Thomas stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, and waited. Brody and his men pulled up, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Brody's eyes swept past Thomas and fixed on the cabin door, a cruel, knowing grin spreading across his face. Calloway, he drawled, heard you took in some stray vermin. She was hurt, Thomas said, his voice flat, just helping her on her way. Is that so? Brody's grin widened. Funny. We heard you was keeping an Apache squaw, one with special markings on her face. We've been looking for her for a long time. She has something that belongs to my family. She has nothing, Thomas said, his grip tightening on the rifle. You need to ride on, Brody. I don't think so, Brody sneered, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. See, that map on her face leads to a place my daddy died looking for, the lost Spanish silver mine, and I aim to find it. Now you can give her to us nice and easy, or we can burn this shack to the ground with both of you inside. The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. This wasn't just about prejudice. It was about greed, a violent, obsessive greed that had clearly already left a trail of bodies. Nahili wasn't banished. She was the last loose end. Thomas made a choice. He had spent 5 years running from life, hiding in his grief. No more. He looked at Brody, his eyes as hard as flint. She's under my roof, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. That makes her my responsibility. Get off my land. Brody's face twisted in rage. You're making a mistake, you grief-sick fool. He started to pull his pistol, but Thomas was faster. He raised his rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Brody's chest. The click of the hammer being cocked was the only sound. Last chance, Brody, Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Brody slowly raised his hands. This ain't over, Calloway, he snarled. We'll be back. And when we come, we're bringing the whole town with us. We'll see who they side with, the decent folk or the man shacked up with a marked savage. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men close behind. Thomas stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching them disappear into the dust. He had won the standoff, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just started a war. He lowered the rifle, his hands shaking, and turned as the cabin door creaked open. Nahili stood there, her face pale. She had heard everything. A map? He asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her eyes filled with a terrible sadness. To a place my people hold sacred, a place of silver. Brody's father tried to take it. He killed many of my family before he was stopped. Brody wants to finish what he started. She looked out at the empty prairie where the riders had vanished. He will come back. I know, Thomas said. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had endured so much, and a cold rage settled deep in his soul. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. Brody had threatened his home, his life, and he had unknowingly dragged the memory of his wife into this ugly mess. It was then that a terrible suspicion began to dawn on him, a puzzle piece clicking into place with sickening clarity. Nahili, he said slowly, you said Brody's men gave you those scars. Did they do anything else? To your people? She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. Before they caught me, our water, it went bad. Many got sick. The elders said it was a curse, that I was the curse. It wasn't a curse, Thomas said, the words like ice in his throat. It was poison. He remembered Sarah in those last weeks, The town doctor had been puzzled. A sudden, violent sickness that came out of nowhere. Sarah had been treating a few of the local Apache for the same thing. She'd been worried. She'd been talking about testing the water source upriver, near Brody's land. She'd said she suspected foul play. And then she'd gotten sick herself. The same symptoms. The same rapid decline. It wasn't just grief that had haunted him for 5 years. It was confusion. Now the confusion was gone, replaced by a horrifying certainty. Brody hadn't just murdered Nahili's family. He had murdered his wife. The war wasn't coming, it was already here. And it had been for 5 long years. The next few days were a blur of frantic preparation. The fragile peace of the ranch was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a coming siege. Thomas and Nahili worked side by side, their earlier, hesitant communication replaced by the clipped, efficient language of 2 soldiers preparing for battle. Every word, every action was focused on one thing: survival. Thomas boarded up the windows, leaving small slits to shoot through. He cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned: his rifle, his shotgun, 2 pistols. He filled every bucket and barrel with water from the well, knowing it could be their last chance. He was no longer the quiet, grieving widower. He was a man with a purpose, fueled by a cold, burning fury. The grief was still there, but now it had a target. Nahili was a revelation. The quiet, wounded woman transformed into a warrior before his eyes. She knew the land in a way he never could. She showed him how to set snares and simple traps along the paths leading to the house, using vines and sharpened sticks. She gathered plants he'd always seen as weeds and made a poultice that drew out infection, and another that, when burned, created a thick, acrid smoke. To make them blind, she explained, her face grim. She moved with a silent, deadly grace, her one good arm working with astonishing speed and precision. She was no longer a victim. She was fighting back. They worked in near silence, but a new powerful bond was being forged between them in the crucible of impending violence. They were 2 broken people, each carrying the weight of a past stolen by the same man. They didn't need to speak of it. They could see it in each other's eyes. They were a team. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the house fortified and ready, Thomas looked at the map etched onto her skin. "Does it have to be a fight?" he asked. "Could we just run?" Nahili shook her head. "He would never stop hunting me. He would never stop hunting us. And where would we run? This world. It is his, not ours." She looked around the small cabin, the first place she had known safety in a long time. "This is our land now. We do not run." Thomas nodded. She was right. He had run for 5 years, hiding in his sorrow. The running stopped here. The second day after Brody's threat, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was bigger this time. Much bigger. Thomas looked through his spyglass. It wasn't just 4 men. It was at least 15, maybe 20. Brody had kept his promise. He had brought the town with him. He had likely spun a story of a dangerous savage and the crazy widower who was protecting her. He had turned fear and prejudice into his own private army. "They're here," Thomas said, his voice grim. Nahili came to stand beside him, peering through a slit in the boards. Her face was calm, her jaw set. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold resolve that matched his own. "Let them come," she whispered. The riders fanned out, surrounding the small house. Thomas could see them clearly now, their faces a mixture of greed, fear, and self-righteous anger. Brody sat on his horse in the center of them all, a smug look on his face. "Calloway!" he bellowed, his voice carrying on the wind. "Last chance. Send out the squaw, and we'll let you live." Thomas raised his rifle to the firing slit. He didn't answer with words. He answered with a bullet. He didn't aim for Brody, not yet. He aimed for the hat of the man next to him, sending it flying off his head. The message was clear. There would be no surrender. All hell broke loose. The air erupted with the roar of rifles and shotguns. Bullets splintered the wood of the cabin walls, thudding into the logs with sickening force. Glass from the remaining panes of the windows shattered. Thomas and Nahili dropped to the floor, crawling to their positions. He took the front window. She took the side. "Don't shoot to kill unless you have to," Thomas yelled over the din. Make them waste their bullets. Make them afraid to get close. They began to return fire, not a wild volley, but measured, calculated shots. A bullet here to make a man duck. A shot there to spook a horse. They were vastly outnumbered, but the cabin provided good cover, and Thomas was a crack shot. The initial chaotic charge faltered. The attackers, realizing this wasn't going to be an easy fight, took cover behind rocks in the small rise of the land. The siege began in earnest. Hours passed. The sun beat down, turning the cabin into an oven. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. They exchanged fire sporadically. Every time one of Brody's men got brave and tried to advance, a well-aimed shot from the cabin would send them scrambling back. Nahili was incredible. She seemed to know where they would move before they did, pointing to a spot and whispering, "Now!" Just a second before a man would break cover. Thomas would fire, and the man would dive back down. But they couldn't keep this up forever. Their ammunition was limited. Their water wouldn't last more than a couple of days. And Brody knew it. They were just waiting them out. As dusk began to fall, the shooting slowed. "They're getting ready to make a move," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his brow. "They'll use the darkness." Nahili nodded. She went to the fireplace and lit the bundle of herbs she had prepared. A thick, choking smoke began to fill the cabin. She carried it to the window, letting the wind carry the smoke towards the attackers' positions. Soon, shouts and coughs could be heard from outside. "It will not stop them," she said, "but it will make them sloppy." Just then, they heard a new sound, a scraping noise from the back of the cabin, where there were no windows. "They're trying to get in the back," Thomas realized. He grabbed the heavy shotgun and motioned for Nahili to stay put. He crept towards the back wall. The scraping grew louder, followed by the splintering of wood. They were trying to break through the logs. He stood to the side of the wall, shotgun raised, his heart pounding. The wood gave way with a crash, and a man's head and shoulders appeared in the opening. Before the man could even see him, Thomas fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and the man was thrown backward out of the hole. Another man tried to scramble through, and Thomas fired the second barrel. The attack from the back was stopped, but he knew it was just a diversion. A volley of shots suddenly concentrated on the front of the house, more intense than before. And then he heard the one sound he had been dreading, the crackle of fire. "They've set the porch on fire!" he yelled. The orange glow began to flicker through the firing slits. The smoke from Nahili's herbs was now mixing with the deadly smoke of the fire. They were being burned out. "We have to get out of here," Thomas said, grabbing Nahili's good arm. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards in the corner. It's our only chance." He dragged a heavy chest aside, revealing a trap door. He pulled it open, revealing a dark, earthy-smelling hole. "Go!" he yelled. Nahili scrambled down the short ladder. Thomas took one last look at his home, the place where he had mourned and hidden for 5 years, now being consumed by flames. He grabbed an extra pistol and a bag of ammunition and followed her down, pulling the heavy trap door shut just as the roof above them began to groan. They were trapped in the dark, listening to their world burn down around them, the triumphant yells of Brody's men echoing from above. They had escaped the fire, but they were buried alive, and it was only a matter of time before Brody and his men realized they weren't in the ashes and came looking for them. The heat from the fire above was intense, turning the small root cellar into a suffocating oven. Dust and ash rained down through the cracks in the floorboards. Thomas and Nahili huddled in the darkness, listening to the roar of the flames and the victorious shouts of the men outside. It sounded like they were tearing the place apart, looking for bodies in the wreckage. "They think we are dead," Nahili whispered, her voice raspy from the smoke. "For now," Thomas replied, "but when they don't find us, they'll search." He knew the cellar had a second, hidden exit. It was a narrow tunnel he had discovered years ago, dug by some previous owner, that led out to the dry arroyo about 50 yards from the house. It was their only hope. "We have to move," he said, "now, while they're distracted." He felt his way along the dirt wall to the back of the cellar, his hands searching for the loose stones that marked the tunnel's entrance. He pulled them away, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A waft of cooler, fresher air met them. "Stay close behind me," he whispered, and crawled into the tunnel. It was a tight squeeze, the earth pressing in on all sides. He could hear Nahili's labored breathing right behind him. It was slow-going, crawling on their hands and knees in pitch blackness, the sound of their own heartbeats deafening in their ears. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint circle of gray light ahead. The exit. He moved faster, pulling himself out from the tunnel and into the pre-dawn gloom of the arroyo. He quickly turned and helped Nahili out. They were covered in dirt and soot, exhausted and battered, but they were alive, and they were free. From the cover of the brush, they could see the smoking ruin of the ranch house. Brody's men were milling around, some kicking through the smoldering timbers. The fire had died down, and a grim mood seemed to have settled over them now that the heat of the battle was over. They hadn't found the bodies. Thomas knew they had only a short window before the hunt began again. "We need to get to the horses," he said. The small corral was thankfully untouched by the fire, but it was on the other side of the house in plain view. "They will see us," Nahili said. "Not if we give them something else to look at." Thomas looked towards the barn, which stood about 100 yards from the house. It was full of dry hay. It was a risk, but it was the only one they had. He handed Nahili one of his pistols. "I'm going to circle around to the barn. When you see it go up in flames, make a run for the horses. Don't wait for me. Just get the horses and ride east, towards the broken mesas. I'll meet you there." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "We go together. We'll both get killed if we go together," he insisted. "This is the only way. Go." He didn't wait for an answer. He squeezed her hand, then slipped away into the shadows, circling wide around the smoldering house. He moved like a ghost, his years on this land guiding his every step. He reached the back of the barn undetected. He pried open a loose board and slipped inside. The smell of hay and leather filled his nostrils. He worked quickly, piling hay against the far wall, the one facing away from the house. He used his flint and steel, and soon a small flame licked at the dry kindling. It caught fast. In seconds, the whole wall was ablaze. Thomas scrambled out the back just as the men at the house started shouting, pointing at the new fire. As he'd hoped, most of them ran toward the barn, trying to save the horses and supplies inside. In that moment of chaos, he saw Nahili, a flash of movement, sprinting from the arroyo to the corral. She was fast. She threw open the gate, vaulted onto the back of his horse, and grabbed the reins of the other. A few of the men saw her, turning and firing wildly, but she was already gone, a fleeting shadow disappearing into the growing light of dawn. Thomas allowed himself a small sigh of relief. She was safe. Now it was his turn. He stayed low, using the distraction of the burning barn to make his own escape in the opposite direction, melting back into the prairie that had been his sanctuary and his prison. The plan was to meet Nahili at the broken mesas, a maze of canyons and rock formations where they could lose their pursuers. But as the sun climbed higher, he knew something was wrong. He cut the trail of the two horses easily enough, but he also saw another set of tracks, at least 3 or 4 riders. They weren't fooled by the barn. A small group, likely led by Brody himself, had seen through the ruse and gone straight after Nahili. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. He pushed himself harder, running until his lungs burned. He had to get to her. He followed the tracks for miles, his hopes sinking with every step. The tracks showed the horses were being ridden hard, pushed to their limits. Then he saw it. Up ahead in a small rocky clearing, one of the horses stood alone, its reins trailing on the ground. Thomas approached cautiously, his pistol drawn. He found Nahili's horse a few yards further, but there was no sign of her. The ground was a mess of scuffed tracks. A struggle had happened here. He found a piece of torn cloth from her shirt, and then he saw the tracks leading away, hoof prints and the unmistakable drag marks of a body being pulled by a rope. They had her. Brody had her. A wave of despair washed over him, so powerful it brought him to his knees. He had failed. He had gotten her away from the fire only to lead her into a trap. But the despair quickly burned away, replaced by a rage so pure and cold, it felt like ice in his veins. This was not over. He looked up at the sky, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew where Brody would take her. He would take her to the place on the map. He would force her to show him the way to the silver mine. Thomas looked at the tracks leading north towards the mountains. He was on foot, without water or supplies, and they had horses and a head start. The odds were impossible, but it didn't matter. They had taken the last thing in the world that mattered to him, and he was going to get her back or die trying. He checked his pistol. 6 shots left. He picked up the trail and began to walk. Each step a promise. Each step a prayer. Each step bringing him closer to Brody, and to the final bloody end of it all. The journey was a waking nightmare. Thomas pushed his body past its limits, fueled by nothing but adrenaline and raw fury. The sun was a hammer, the land a vast, unforgiving anvil. He ran when he could, walked when he had to, his eyes constantly scanning the tracks ahead. He knew this land. He knew the shortcuts, the hidden springs, the game trails that didn't show on any map. This was his advantage. Brody had the horses, but Thomas had the land itself on his side. He found a small spring and drank deeply, refilling his canteen. He chewed on some dried meat he had in his pockets, the last of his supplies. He knew he was in a race against time. Brody wouldn't be patient. He would hurt Nahili to make her cooperate. The thought of it made Thomas move faster, ignoring the pain in his legs and the fire in his lungs. After a day and a half of relentless tracking, he reached the foothills of the mountains. The tracks were fresher now. He was closing the distance. He climbed a high ridge and used his spyglass. There, below him, in a narrow canyon, he saw them. A small campfire and 3 figures, Brody and 2 of his men, and a 4th figure tied to a tree, Nahili. Even from this distance, he could see she was slumped over, unmoving. A blind rage surged through him, and he almost charged down the hill right then. But he stopped himself. That would be suicide. He was 1 man against 3. He had to be smart. He had to be patient. He had to be a ghost. He waited for nightfall, the cold mountain air doing nothing to cool the fire inside him. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. Perfect. He left his boots behind, his bare feet making no sound on the rock and pine needles. He crept down the ridge, moving from shadow to shadow, his pistol clutched in his hand. He got within 50 yards of the camp. The 2 men were sitting by the fire drinking whiskey. Brody was standing over Nahili, holding a torch. "I'm tired of asking nicely," Brody was saying, his voice a low snarl. "The sun comes up, you're either going to walk us to that mine, or I'm going to start carving a new map on the rest of your skin." Nahili didn't answer. She just lifted her head, and in the torchlight, Thomas could see the defiance still blazing in her eyes. That sight gave him all the strength he needed. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't take all 3 at once. He had to even the odds. He saw one of the men get up and walk towards the edge of the camp, into the darkness, to relieve himself. This was his chance. Thomas moved like a phantom, circling around behind the man. He came up behind him, clamping a hand over his mouth before he could make a sound. He didn't use his gun. A gunshot would alert the others. He used the knife he carried on his belt. It was brutal, silent, and quick. 1 down. He dragged the body further into the shadows and took the man's pistol and ammunition belt. Now he had 2 guns. The odds were better. 2 against 2. He crept back towards the camp. Brody and the remaining man were getting nervous, calling out for their friend. "Probably passed out drunk in the bushes," the man grumbled. "Go find him," Brody ordered. The man picked up a lantern and started walking towards the spot where Thomas was hidden. Thomas held his breath, pressing himself flat against a rock. The man walked right past him, his lantern casting flickering shadows. Thomas let him go about 20 feet, then he stepped out. "Looking for me?" he said, his voice a low growl. The man spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He fumbled for his pistol, but Thomas was too fast. He fired once. The shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder. The man dropped without a sound. In the camp, Brody whirled around, his face a mask of disbelief. "Calloway, you're dead!" "Not yet," Thomas said, stepping into the firelight. He held a pistol in each hand, both aimed at Brody. "Let her go, Brody." Brody laughed, a high, unhinged sound. He grabbed Nahili, pulling her up and pressing the barrel of his own pistol to her head. "You drop them guns or she dies right now. You came all this way just to watch me kill her?" "This is between you and me," Thomas said, his voice steady, even though his heart was about to pound out of his chest. "It always has been. This started when you murdered my wife." A flicker of surprise crossed Brody's face. Then it was replaced by a smug grin. Sarah? She got what she deserved, sticking her nose where it didn't belong, just like you. It was the confession Thomas needed, the last piece. Let Nahili go, Thomas said again, and I'll give you a chance you didn't give Sarah. I got a better idea, Brody snarled. He shoved Nahili towards Thomas, and in that split second of distraction, he fired. But Thomas was ready. He dove to the side, feeling the bullet sing past his ear. He rolled and came up firing. His first shot hit Brody in the shoulder, making him scream and drop his pistol. His second shot hit him in the leg, and Brody went down hard. Thomas was on him in a second, kicking the gun away, pressing the barrel of his own pistol between Brody's eyes. Brody lay on the ground, whimpering, his arrogance gone, replaced by a pathetic terror. Please, he gasped, don't! Thomas looked down at the man who had taken everything from him. He saw Sarah's face. He saw the flames devouring his home. He saw Nahili tied to the tree. And he felt nothing. The rage was gone, burned out, leaving only a cold, empty quiet. Killing him would be easy, but it wouldn't bring Sarah back. It wouldn't rebuild his home. It would just be one more ghost on this haunted land. He lowered the pistol. No, he said, his voice hollow. Death is too quick. You're going to live with what you've done. He walked over to Nahili and cut her bonds. She stumbled into his arms, weak but alive. He held her close, feeling her heart beat against his. It was over. They took one of Brody's horses and left him there, injured but alive. They left him for the law or for the coyotes. Thomas didn't care which. As they rode away from the canyon, the sun began to rise, washing the sky in colors of pink and gold. It was the first sunrise in 5 years that didn't feel like a curse. They didn't go back to the ashes of the ranch. There was nothing for them there. They rode south towards a new life, a future they would build together. They were two outcasts, a grieving cowboy and a banished Apache woman, scarred and broken by the world. But they had found each other. They had faced down the darkness and walked out into the light. The wind still blew across the high prairie, but for the first time, it didn't sound like a mournful song of loneliness. It sounded like a promise of peace, hard-earned and fiercely protected, a promise of a new home, not a place built of logs and nails, but a home they would build in each other. Their story wasn't one that would be written in any history books, but it was a story etched on the land, on their hearts, and in the quiet strength of their joined hands as they rode toward the horizon, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them for good. That was an intense one, right? The story of Thomas and Nahili shows that even in the deepest grief and against the ugliest hate, courage and connection can change everything. It makes you wonder what you would be willing to fight for. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival, justice, and the strange and dark things that happen on the edges of the map, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell. It helps a ton, and it means you'll never miss another story. Let me know in the comments below what you think Brody's final fate was. Until next time, stay safe out there.